Just curious, the thoughts on what's going on currently in the economy, and I think, as you noted, they did acknowledge that even this target that's 0.5% lower than last year could be difficult to achieve. And if you look at things like tax revenues, electricity consumption, I mean, there are some indicators out there that suggest this economy is almost stagnating already. What odds do you guys place on there being a much more severe type of downturn in progress this year than we've, every year it takes some degree of stimulus to hit these targets, but I guess I'd like to handicap the scenario where it takes very aggressive stimulus to come anywhere near 7%, given what seems to be very negative news on the ground right now.
We just see when we talk to companies, I mean, I think the risk clearly to me reads the risks are on the downside, except for very niche companies with niche products and the services to offer. And then if you put together what company tells you and try to kind of get a macro picture, I think the headwinds is definitely pretty significant, and I think that's why they did the stimulation, mortgage easing and the housing sector stimulus over the weekend, because after all they realized the importance of not letting go the construction, the new home construction, new home starts, and the real estate activities. I mean, that's kind of the stimulus in the housing market reads to me as kind of the admission of the serious problems and the headwinds they see in the macroeconomy.
I think in response to Brian's question, I have seen the preliminary statistical results for the first quarter of 2015, and the numbers are not very encouraging. The real estate market, I think, is performing less well than most of us, including myself, had expected. Rail cargo traffic is down to almost zero growth. Electricity consumption is down to almost zero growth, which all suggests that something is going on that is less positive than many of us had expected. Now, I'm not over impressed by the electricity and the cargo numbers because they relate primarily to certain sectors of the economy. I think the electricity consumption is very much influenced by the heavy industries in steel and aluminum, and we know that there's tremendous excess capacity in those industries, and that probably is the main explanation for the very low growth or zero growth in cargo traffic on the rails and in electricity consumption. I am broadly optimistic that the slowdown will be controlled. We are probably running well below 7% growth at the moment, but we are not, I think, heading for a cliff.
The exporter is also a soft spot because, I mean, we discussed this before with RMB soft pegged to US dollar, which is gaining strength against euros and the Japanese yen, and also the other, emerging markets who are financially fragile, and the oil exporters. So that's a negative for the Chinese exporters, right? And we've already seen that from the earnings. The guys who export low-end, pretty much everything, manufacturing devices and healthcare devices, and they're, it's pretty significant. So, I mean, Peter, do you still think that the government will actually depreciate RMB? Because that would be positive to the economy.
I think that's an important point, and we might as well talk about it right away.
Let's wait. We're going to be talking about currency a little bit later.
Can I just comment
Absolutely.
on the export point that Junheng was making? I totally agree with her. Export growth, like many other economic indicators, confirmed the slowdown, and the decline in export growth, but there's still growth, mind you, is more than we had expected, but in a way that's a saving grace, because otherwise the external trade surplus would have gone through the ceiling. Imports are further down, sometimes even in absolute terms, because the slowdown in the economy, particularly the heavy industry, and because of the further decline in import prices. So imports are way down. So the trade surplus is actually embarrassingly high at the moment, and would be even higher if the export growth had been higher. So I'm not so overly concerned about it, because the macro picture remains relatively stable. Whether in the last quarter of 2014 we saw a fairly substantial net outflow of capital on the balance of payments, that seems to have stabilized in the first quarter of this year. We no longer see significant net outflow of capital. In fact, we see zero net outflow of capital at the moment.
But why, Peter, do you think? Why do you think export or the export deficit surplus is more a priority to the government than the export revenue for the whole economy? Because if they loosen, if they ease on renminbi, then that'll be positive to the economy and that'll be positive to the capital markets. I mean, look at what happened to Japan, right? That's a big boost.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and I'm not denying there is an issue, but the slowdown in export growth, I emphasize growth, doesn't really worry me so much, because the trade surplus remains very high. In fact, is larger than it has been for years. So that is one of the factors that has stopped the net capital outflow. And the slowdown in export growth, of course, has something to do with the exchange rate. We could talk about that in more detail later, but the Chinese currency has depreciated less than almost any other currency, major currency in the world. They have stayed very close to the dollar parity that they had for most of the last 5 years.
Yeah, that's pretty evident in the outbound, the tourism, because it's so cheap to travel in Europe and in Japan.
Yeah,
so that's the one industry that's actually growing leaps and bounds.
Whereas the commodity trade surplus is still growing, which they had hoped would not be the case, because they have an embarrassingly large net external current account surplus. The service balance is becoming increasingly negative. Services is generally about 1/3 of total trade, 2/3 is commodity trade. And China, partly because of the enormous increase in the outflow of Chinese tourism, the services balance is rapidly becoming increasingly negative. On that point, just an interesting anecdotal number, the number of Chinese tourists that went abroad last year is more than 100 million. They're probably the number one or number two tourism originator in the world now.
So therefore, you can argue domestic consumption is underreported, because outbound, the Chinese spend overseas, they buy luxury retail, luxury everything, like luxury bags and soft, hard, luxury stuff from overseas, and services, and perhaps education too. So you can argue then, domestic consumption in that way is underestimated.
Well, tourism would not count as domestic consumption anyway, because that's a net export.
No, I'm just saying, like, a Chinese consumption as a percentage of GDP is underestimated because of that.
It probably is, yes, it probably is. We've been making that point for years. They have no accurate way of measuring household consumption. They have something called the retail statistic, but that measures all sorts of things that are not necessarily household consumption. The best way to measure household consumption is the quarterly household expenditure survey. And we only have that on a quarterly basis. And we will just probably have to wait until June before we have the first quarter of this year.
And also, this part of consumption, it's hardly positive for domestic economy. How would the Chinese people go to Europe, go to Paris, buy, Chanel bags, be positive to the Chinese economy? It's certainly great for France, for the French economy, right? But perhaps it's not too much underestimate or underreporting, because it's not really relevant to domestic economy.
I agree with that also, yeah. I think the Chinese tourism, very few people have focused on that, but is rapidly becoming a major factor in the overall external economic relations of China, because it's such a huge import of services. That's how it is statistically recorded. An import of services is Chinese tourism abroad, which is huge in Europe, in the rest of Asia. It's becoming big in the US, but the US is a laggard in that respect.